You're watching the 2028 Darktide presidential debates, hosted by Sloptide News Network. Former President Biden, President Trump, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Our first question regards the dueling sword, a very popular object of debate in Darktide. What are your administration's stances on this weapon, and how will you handle it should you be elected president? President Trump, you have the floor. Afterwards, President Biden will be allowed a chance to respond.
Many people are saying that the great and beautiful dueling sword is one of the best weapons ever made. I will make sure that it is returned to the hands of the psyker. I will make an executive order to prevent dangerous zealots and veterans from bringing these weapons into our games. Let's make Darktide great again by restoring this wonderful weapon to its original owner.
Former President Biden, your response?
Listen here, Fat. The Darktide dream is for everyone, not just some. My administration will work to make certain that every household has access to this weapon, not just those who were born as psychers. The fact that Ogrins, hard-working Ogrins, come into this game expecting to achieve their dreams and then are denied dueling swords is malarkey. My administration will be granting dueling swords to all Ogrins and forgiving crafting material debts so that everyone can afford to upgrade their weapons.
Mr. President, Mr. Former President, thank you very much for your responses. I'd like to ask you now, if elected president of Darktide, what would your administration's top priorities be in your first few weeks in office?
When I am president, I will be deporting all Ogrins back to where they came from immediately. On day one, I will sign an executive order reverting all the buffs that crooked Joe Biden illegally gave to these Ogrins. It will be illegal to play as Ogrin, and we will build the wall to keep them out of havoc forever. We are putting our human classes first.
Former President Biden, your response?
My main priority as president will be to send more Moby and Steel to the second hive city so that I can commit more genocide.
Ah, the dueling sword. Love it or hate it, it's certainly one of the weapons of all time. It is, without a doubt, the most powerful melee weapon in all of Darktide, and it has always been this way, but it really only came onto many players' radar in the last 6 months. And fun fact, our new update that's coming on the 25th will be the exact 6-month anniversary of the Unlocked and Loaded update, the one that added it to all of the good classes in the game. Sorry, Ogrins. So, happy half birthday, Dueling Sword. This comes at a time where the Dueling Sword's future is a bit uncertain, and that's what I want to discuss in the video today. Since I've seen confirmation from Fat Shark actually communicating with us for once that they have been discussing internally the fate of the dueling sword. The outcry has gotten loud enough that they're actually considering making some changes, potentially. And there's tons and tons of debate on what these changes should be. Should every other weapon in the game be brought up to dueling sword level? Should the dueling sword be returned to its original psyker class and that would balance it? Should the dueling sword see a small nerf or maybe even a big nerf? There are opinions that bridge the whole spectrum. Now, before I get into any of the discussion that folks are having online or Fat Shark's reaction to them, I want to show you where you guys as a community stand, because I think this is actually very, very surprising information. It certainly surprised me. So a few days ago, I ran a community poll that you might have stumbled across. I have gotten over 2,000 responses to this poll, and the choices were very simple. Should the dueling sword receive a nerf? And the choices were nerf it, or leave it alone, maybe buff some other stuff. And upon creation of this poll, I accidentally made a mistake, and I selected it as a multiple choice question. But I think this serves something to our purpose here today, because I can use it to farm for engagement. Yay! So here's the time where I want you to scroll down towards the comments. If you're on the way to the comments and you have not yet liked the video and subscribed, please do that now. And then in the comments, please tell me in percentage, what percentage of players you think want to nerf the dueling sword. Alright, I'm assuming that you put that down in the comments, liked and subscribed. Would you believe that 85% of players want to nerf the dueling sword? If you believe that, that's great for you, but that's incorrect. Actually, only 46% of players actually want to nerf the dueling sword. And 54% of players say it's fine and we should be buffing other stuff. This result really surprised me. So much of the conversation around the dueling sword is had by a very vocal minority, players who are very invested in the game, right? Have invested a lot of hours and want to see other stuff. And I was shocked to see that even in my community, which generally self-selects for being more engaged with Darktide, the odds were in favor of not nerfing the dueling sword. So I went about a bit of exploration through the Fat Shark forums, trying to find varying opinions of nerf versus non-nerf, and I'm going to present the best from both sides here today as far as I could determine. I'll provide a point and then a counterpoint, and I'll try to do my best to steelman or provide the best logical argument for a certain case for each one of these arguments in favor or against nerfing the dueling sword. And this post here is where we will begin our deep dive into the ongoing discussion and debate regarding the dueling sword. Fat Shark, open to conversation on dueling sword. This post by Guar here, who is responding to Fat Shark Straw Hat, saying they are open to conversations regarding the dueling sword in the replies to the first set of balance patches, the third devblog part where they're talking about some small changes to other weapons like the Katachan swords, the very, very minor weapon buffs that are coming out with this upcoming patch. And what they assert here is that these conversations regarding the dueling sword have been happening for months, and they more or less unanimously say that the dueling sword is an overpowered, no-skill joyride of a weapon that trivializes difficult content and invalidates most of their melee weapons by existing in its current state. Love the Tide games because they require skill and decision-making. Weapons have trade-offs, strengths, weaknesses, and aren't mindless to use. The dueling sword trivializes content and does not require meaningful skill to use. So right away, addressing something that is being claimed here that we have just proven with a very, very large sample size to be incorrect. People do not unanimously say that this dueling sword is overpowered, no-skill joyride. A lot of players still want this thing to retain the current power level it has and still want to retain access to it. There is a argument to be made for all the things that this player says, though. And let's dive a little bit deeper into the replies to this forum thread, which you can see here has 327 replies, and see what the other players think. The first player I want to pause at here, right off the bat, is Durandal94, who says, "I'm so sick of the DS that honestly, I wouldn't even be mad if they made it the worst weapon in the game." And this is an opinion that is sort of mirrored by a good number of other forum goers here. And I'd like to break down why. For me personally, the reason that I tend to lean on the side of nerfing the dueling sword is because it is just so dominant in all aspects of life. So to explain what my issue is with the dueling sword, before we go any further with these forum comments, I just kind of want to give you my 2 cents on the issue. And my take arises from the fact that I primarily am a build creator. I like making builds, I like making interesting builds, and I miss making builds that had a variety of different weapons associated with them. I love finding all the edge cases uses for all these different weapons in my varied builds. And that's something that I really have disliked about Havoc in general, is there's less diversity of builds available. And there's something I really dislike about the dueling sword, is it forces a lack of diversity by being so oppressively good at everything that it does. To relate this to you further, let me tell you a little bit of an anecdote here. I mean, you're watching the video, so you have to be signing up for a mystery anecdote. When I was crafting this build way back when, before Havoc was even a thing, and I thought there might be a need for a support-focused build within Havoc, I put together this build. The idea being we're going to be doing chorus, and we want to be using Pious Cutthroat here to get backstab kills and get our resets as fast as possible. And my thought was that if I'm doing lots of chorus, well, I should lean fully into being a support zealot. And therefore, what better weapon than the Crusher? The Crusher has really solid damage to Captain Shields, so you can burst those open for your team really quickly. It also has Skull Crusher. which staggers enemies. And when enemies are staggered, they take a ton of extra damage. Really, really cool. So I thought this weapon would be excellent as a pair with this build. And it's not bad, right? It executes enemies pretty well. You need to get behind them and execute them for the reduction in your cooldown. That's the whole idea of the build. And not too bad, right? The problem with the Crusher, though, is its lack of mobility and lack of attack speed, because if I need to get behind an enemy, I have to sprint around behind them. And this weapon doesn't have any movement tech to allow me to move any faster when I'm trying to sprint or sprint slide. So this weapon, it kind of had to go. And so I went back to the drawing board, and my second thought was, okay, so I need a weapon with some more mobility that does good backstabs, that can get behind enemies, hold them in place while I kill them. And so the second thing I came up with was the Combat Blade. Combat Blade is a perfect fit for this build, right? It's super fast. Like, you can move 20% faster when you're channeling this thing, and it has a very nice headshot multiplier, and it has a hidden 20% backstab damage built into it. So it's a natural fit for this build just because it allows you to move very quickly. You get lots of hits in really quickly. You can hold enemies in place with this push stab like this while you get the backstab hits. The only downside of it is that it doesn't do very well in straight up confrontations with enemies like this. Like, it can take very long to get rid of them, and it relies very heavily to do so on its bleed stacks, and bleed stacks can't give you that backstab bonus. So I rethought it for a little bit, and I went back to the drawing board looking for a weapon that would fit the bill even better. And wouldn't you know it, there is one weapon that fits the bill even better. It's, of course, the Dueling Sword. The Dueling Sword is the perfect answer for this build because it has the fastest movement speed in the game for sprinting speed. It has a movement tech, or two movement techs even, that allow you to get yourself into position while also being aggressive. And then you can channel thrust and make certain that that first hit that you do is the hit that gets the execution and therefore claims the kill and gets your cooldown back. It doesn't hurt that this weapon also has amazing upfront damage and stagger potential that allows you to erase hard enemies like that without even thinking about it. So Dueling Sword replaced those other two weapons without even a moment's hesitation. This isn't even the only building that's happened on. I've had it happen with veteran builds, I've had it happen with Psyker builds, which both used other, I would say, more interesting weapon choices before. And that's just how I tend to feel as a build creator, is I feel cheated of opportunities to create builds that highlight other weapons. You might say, hey, Mystery, we don't need the Dueling Sword in every build. We would like to see some builds with other weapons. And I try to get those to you from time to time, but you have to think of it from the perspective of someone who comes to my channel and checks out a video for the first time. They are coming here because they want to see the optimal builds, right? And most players, as we just saw in our statistics a second ago, most players don't really view the Dueling Sword as all that OP. They want the best build regardless of what it takes. And so I put Dueling Swords on my builds because it is just that much better. And I want players to have a positive interaction with the first build they play from my channel. And for many of them, that means we're going to be using the Dueling Sword to produce results. Proponents of buffing other weapons in the stead of nerfing the Dueling Sword argue that maybe the reason everyone is using Dueling Sword is just because there is a lack of other good options. And I could see where this is the case. In fact, if we take a little bit of a stroll down the Zealots melee list, we can see that there's a good number of stinker weapons in here. The combat axes in general haven't seen very favorable scaling with the amount of armor that's on the field now. The shock mauls are just pretty terrible weapons all around and need some real reworks to be viable. Tactical axes, though beloved by some YouTubers, have incredibly short range and still harbor less mobility than the Dueling Sword and the dagger for some reason. Then we've got the chain swords, which are cool weapons in principle, but often don't have enough oomph to justify their long charge-up times. The Devil's Claw swords, which rely heavily on your skill as a player to parry enemies' attacks back at them, which is a cool idea, but I don't think it does enough damage in practice. The Thunder Hammer, which you barely ever see anymore, since it's just so slow to wield around. Then we've got the Crusher, which is good into some builds, but has low damage overall. And The Relic Blade. Oh, the Relic Blade is actually a pretty good weapon that most people would agree is a solid A tier to S tier weapon. Yes, it's outclassed by the dueling sword, but I think it's a gold standard for what people want in a very playable weapon. And you can see that players are gravitating towards it because it is fun and produces good results. Then we've got the chain axes. Those things, man, I have not seen one of those in a very, very long time. And for the Zealot, you've got the heavy eviscerators. I wish these things were so much more powerful. They look cool and powerful, but they get outclassed by many other weapons. And then we get the heavy swords that are sort of somewhere in the middle there. So, as an experienced and long-time player, when I look at this list, I do see some validity to the argument that a lot of these weapons are pretty dang bad. It's not that they are completely unplayable, it's just that they are only playable at lower difficulties. And I think Havoc as a game mode has really exacerbated this issue. User Monica2333 here says that they think that weapon balance should be balanced from the higher difficulties rather than lower difficulties. And while I don't know that this is actually how they balance the game, it does make some sense that many of the weapons in the list are very, very usable and work just fine on lower difficulties. The Devil Swords and the Chain Swords and all that stuff are great when you're playing on Malice difficulty. But as soon as you step it up to Auric Damnation, or especially into Havoc, you start to notice that the weapons that are a little bit clunkier, like the Chain Axe, like the Thunderhammer, just don't really have a place anymore. And so I'd love to see a revisit to some of these weapons, like the Shock Maul, where we look at their damage numbers and how quickly they can put out that damage and sort of try to get those DPS values in check. Because I think that's a really big limiting factor for weapons that are being brought into games is with the current state of the game and how every spawn door is an absolute clown car. We need to be chopping through like 5 elites a second in order to keep up with the game's spawn rates. And if you can't do that, if your weapon can't do that, it's not even a consideration. The dueling sword is certainly at the top of this list, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have other contenders. And you can tell what the other contenders are because you can look around at things that people are bringing into games, and you'll still see combat blades and you'll still see relic blades, which lets you know that these weapons are meeting that standard. User Elodie here posts something that I think is very relevant for how we should expect to see Fat Shark address this issue going forward. And that is, they put this option as having 3 solutions. If you want to rebalance the game, if you want to rebalance these weapons, you could nerf the outliers, nerf the few weapons that are sticking up above the rest. That would have a very minimal cost in terms of time, effort, research, all that stuff, and would have a very minimal risk involved because if you mess up just that one weapon, you haven't screwed anything else over. Then the second option is you could buff everything else. This is something that I think many people would agree they want to happen, is a general balance overhaul for a lot of the lower tier weapons in the game, but it incurs a lot of risk. It's a big, big time investment, therefore it's a big, big money investment, and it just might not be realistic at this point to see all that much stuff change. It's going to take a long time if they do want to do it. The third option is to do nothing, right? And for the last 6 months, Fat Shark has been doing nothing. The dueling sword has seen no changes, and only now are we starting to see them start to turn those gears and get something into action. The way that we know that Fat Shark is interested in addressing this issue in the relatively short term is that they are starting to post about it on the forums. Fat Shark Straw Hat responded several times to this thread, saying that after the update on the 25th, they're looking to get a dev blog out where they can explain their thinking behind balancing, or rather their hesitation to make balance changes. Not necessarily specifically to Dueling Sword, that's not said here, but perhaps also addressing the fact that lower performing weapons haven't been brought up to snuff as quickly as some players would like. They also want to acknowledge that the community has made their points and validate those, which I think is awesome. They state that they want this to be a two-way thing, which will be excellent. There definitely needs to be some sort of communication when big changes like this go on, lest we have a situation like with the Ogryn changes a few months back, where no one still has any idea why those were made. So I would love to see this happen, and when it does, I will certainly be notifying you, members of my community, so that you can go and voice your opinions. If you have that level of skin in the game and you really want the thing nerfed, or you really want it to be protected, you can go into the forum and let them know what your opinion is. Until then, I think we are providing a really good service for the community by taking this community poll. Over 2,000 of you, by the way, thank you if you did respond. Over 2,000 of you responded, and I think that is an amazing sample size for a community the size that Darktide is, just to share like how you feel about this weapon. It surprised me that it is so evenly split. So that would tell me, if I was Fatshark looking at that poll, that whatever I do, the answer needs to be very meted and very measured, and they need to explain it, because this is about the worst possible split they could have, this 45-55 split, right? If they do something really strong one way, it's going to piss off the maximum number of people on the other side. If it was like 30-70, they could say, fuck it, let's just nerf it to the ground, and those 30% of people can like eat dirt. That's not the case now. You're going to piss off half of the player base if you do one of the other options. So a very measured response needs to be their strategy going forward here, and I think opening that dialogue 2 ways to communicate why they're making the changes they make is the surest way to land this plane. So given that the community is roughly split on this issue, it's safe to say that if Fatshark does listen to the community, and one half wants it nerfed and the other half doesn't want it touched and wants other things buffed, that the answer that's going to make the community the happiest, and therefore hopefully the one that Fatshark trends towards, is something in the middle. And since this video is about the dueling sword and not about all the other buffs you could bring to all the other weapons in the game, let's talk about what nerfs might be coming to the dueling sword. Hopefully they are small. We can start small and move up from there if it's still not enough. And I think there's 3 main areas that could be nerfed for the dueling sword. And I'm going to talk about these in order of likelihood from least likely to most likely. The least likely area to see nerfs for the dueling sword is its blessings, which admittedly are very powerful. It has access to some of the best blessings in the game. The 4 that really stand out for me are Precognition, Riposte, Thrust, and Uncanny Strike. Just one by one, Precognition and Riposte activate on dodge. They give you 20% critical chance and like a bunch of finesse. It's like 60% finesse, I think. If you're good at dodging and counterattacking, these 2 up your DPS insanely. This is great for frontline fighters like Zealots. And then we have the Assassins combo, which is Uncanny Strike and Thrust. Thrust allows you to channel your attack before you launch it, which means that if you're using the dueling sword's excellent mobility to keep spacing for your enemies, you can back up and then come in and drop a supercharged attack on their face. This again synergizes super well with Zealots, who can use 2 of their 3 abilities to overcharge attacks and make them hit extra hard. Just drop crushes in 1 hit, no problem. Yeah, Thrust is very, very good. And then Uncanny Strike is very broken on pretty much every weapon it's on, because it allows you just to ignore the fact that armored enemies exist, really. They just turn into big walking pools of health. And it also scales range damage if you can swap quickly enough. So it's really nice for swapping to your Flamer, your Bolter, or even swapping to your Flame Staff. So with those 4 blessings being as powerful as they are, if you were to remove any of them from the dueling sword, you would run into a problem, which is that there's still 2 more to be played with. Even if you remove 2, you could play with the other 2 and it would still be just as good, pretty much. If you removed all 4, you would be running afoul of a second problem, which is that Fatshark's goal is to have every weapon have at least 10 blessings available to it, and you'd have to find some other blessing to put on the thing. You can't have everyone running around with like 3 blessings to choose from, basically. And if you put other blessings on it, you run the chance of one of those being broken too, and then you're back in the same place you started. So I highly doubt they'll touch any of the blessing options for the weapon. The second place they might touch up on the dueling sword is its mobility. And there's a couple of factors to its mobility. One is its just general move and sprint speed. It's the highest in the game, tied with the dagger, which in some regards makes sense because it's a very light weapon. It also has movement techs, which allow you to boost your speed. You can swing the light attack 1 in order to boost your speed very quickly, or you can channel a heavy attack 1 in order to thrust and slide yourself across the ground. As you saw a few minutes ago, you can use this for both offense and defense at the same time, repositioning yourself while also claiming a kill. Very, very potent movement abilities, and the fact that it also has a very, very high dodge counts means that, yeah, you can use this weapon to be insanely mobile and therefore insanely defensive. It's obvious that being mobile is very powerful in this game when you look at Zealot, the game's most powerful class, and just how insanely hard they are to kill, most of that tied with their nuts mobility. And the Dueling Sword gives that to every class that can use it. So they might do something with its mobility. They might take away its ability to use its movement text, or they might take away some dodge count. It's very dangerous to take away mobility, but if it is such a DPS powerhouse, perhaps they could turn it into something like the Kanachan, the not the combat blades, the swords, where you stand your ground and you use this weapon special to riposte and parry into enemies, and it could just be like a straight up DPS, more akin to how Saltspire's Rapier is in Vermintide 2. The last and most likely thing that they will see a change for the Dueling Sword is its damage profiles. You know, this is something that I have a hard time talking about because I am an outside observer to this game and not a knower of all of the code in the world, but damage calculations in this game are extremely complex, and very small tweaks can go a long way. So if I were to sit here and say, oh, they need to nerf the finesse multiplier, they need to nerf damage versus unyielding or carapace or whatever, that stuff could very easily snowball and end up in a situation where the Dueling Sword is worse than useless. So I will leave that, calculating what damage tweaks need to be done, to the professionals, the people that know the code behind the scene and can actually crunch these numbers. But I do think that it's very likely that we will be seeing some changes to those, because it is a bit absurd to me that this weapon has attacks as fast as it does and it has top of the line damage, especially when you consider how they seem to be intending to balance weapons like the Relic Blade and like all these Ogren weapons, which all fall around a kind of a median of power. And then you have this outlier of the Dueling Sword that penetrates all armor and its crits are triple damage, right? So I think it's very likely we'll see a change to the weapon's damage, but I have no idea what that will be specifically. So that's about it for where this debate has led us. There's equal numbers of people on both sides, and they are arguing from different levels of experience, different levels of play and comfort, and they both have very valid points. In fact, I agree with both sides. Not to be a both sides-er here, but the players who don't want the nerf and instead want other things buffed have a very valid point. There's tons of weapons that are just so clunky and not at all rewarding in terms of the skill and the investment that you put into them. It makes no sense that a Thunderhammer charge attack does less than a Dueling Sword crit, right? These sort of things need to be evened out, and a thing that I've been saying for a long time is that weapons that have like special abilities, like activated stuff in this game, excepting the new Force Greatsword and the Relic Blade, which I think are great examples of balance, are very poor. I would love to see interesting weapons like the Thunderhammer and the Shock Maul and the Eviscerators and the Chainswords be brought into relevancy. Like, I dream of a meta where the Heavy Eviscerator is the best weapon for Zealot. I think that would be so cool, because something that the Dueling Sword lacks is a sense of like viscerality, like, sawing enemies in half. It's just so bland in its presentation, right? That's one thing that really kills me about it. At the same time, I don't think the Dueling Sword can go without a nerf. I hate to say. Sorry, Dueling Sword loyalists, all 54% of you, but yeah, the weapon is the best weapon in the game, and that's not really the problem. The problem is that it's the best weapon in the game by a margin of like 30 to 40%. And I would be okay if that nerf doesn't knock it off its throne, but instead just kind of takes it down to like being only the best by 5 or 10%. Because right now, when I'm making builds and thinking about which weapon should I use with certain range weapons or whatever, there is no debate. It's not even close. But if you made it so the situation is like, oh, maybe I could use Relic Blade with this. Like, yeah, this is like, they're pretty comparable, like with this certain build, then it would make it much more interesting to build around and to engage with this weapon being in the discussion. So that is my feeling about Dueling Sword. And be sure to let me know what your feelings are down in the comments about this. I imagine I'll get lots of comments on this one, just as I did on the poll as well. And especially just maybe you can like make me realize that I'm being insane about one of these points, but I think the answer is somewhere in that happy medium. If you are a please don't nerf Dueling Sword loyalist, I have one final thing I want to show you, just to kind of soften what I think is the inevitable blow. Let's take a trip back in time to see the origins, the humble origins of the Dueling Sword. We're going all the way back to October of 2023 with patch 13, which is, as some of you might remember, some of you oldsters in here might remember, that is the update that brought us all the class talent trees. But at the same time, there was a ton of changes to weapons. This was an absolutely massive patch, and snuck in here was a buff for a humble weapon at the time, the little known Macabian Mark IV Dueling Sword. And if you were a psyker at the time, you were just bopping along, doing your little head pops, but not smiting. Smiting wasn't in the game yet. And they put this buff to the Macabian Mark IV Dueling Sword. They took its heavy attacks from doing 180 damage to 360 damage. And they took its finesse multiplier from 130 damage to 270% damage. So they doubled its finesse multiplier and doubled its attack damage on the heavy attacks. And this was the beginning of it all. This was where this weapon went from being just a weapon to something like super godly, and it took a while for that to filter through to the main population. So you can see this weapon has like just got this insane buff almost 2 years ago at this point, or a year and a half ago at this point. And the way I think about it is, listen, if Fat Shark did this sort of buff to this weapon, they could nerf it a little bit, right? Think about if Ogren's weapons were to get this sort of buff. It's not happening, right? They didn't double any attack damage. They didn't double the finesse modifier. They gave him like 25% more. They're clearly not in the role of doing these huge buffs and huge nerfs anymore. That sort of Fat Shark is long gone. We're gonna see a more metered and measured approach to these things. So what I would totally expect is reining some of this absurdity in just a little bit, bringing it back down in line with some other stuff. So get Fat Shark giveth, Fat Shark taketh away. It's their game to do with what they want. They can absolutely destroy the Dueling Sword, and I guarantee you, we will survive, guys. We'll just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we'll get through our Havoc 40 some other way. Anyway, I really appreciate you listening. Until next time, Mr. E's out of here. Have a good one. Bye.